Hey guys, welcome back to more HOA Karen stories. In this video, imagine a homeowner association Karen so delusional that she tapes fake violation notices to your house, threatens to tow your ATV off your property that is not even in her HOA, and then sends her own son to commit crimes. Let's dive right into the ripe stories. And the first one is from r/OhNoConsequences and is titled, HOA Karen's son stole my ATV thinking he's untouchable, but I am police. I bought my house because it checked every box for us. It had a decent garage, a little workshop in the back, enough yard to feel like we had breathing room, and best of all, it was not part of the HOA attached to the development next to us. The listing was clear about that. It bordered the neighborhood, but it was outside the association, and that was one of the main reasons why I liked it. I deal with rules all day at work as a police officer. I did not want to come home and have a stranger telling me what color my mailbox should be or whether my garage door was allowed to be open for 20 minutes on a Saturday. Unfortunately, that's almost exactly what happened. We had barely been there a week when I got my first visit. I was in the driveway, unloading tools and a few boxes from my trailer, when this woman came straight across my lawn with the kind of confidence you only get from never being told no enough. No hello, no introduction, nothing. She stopped a few feet away, looked past me towards the garage and said, "You cannot leave that visible." At first I thought she meant the moving boxes. "I'm unloading." She pointed towards my ATV in the garage. "No, that. Recreational vehicles are not allowed to be visible from the street." I remember just looking at her for a second because it was such a bizarre opening line from a complete stranger. Then I said, "This house is not in your HOA." She gave me this tight, annoyed look and said, "This property is part of the community." "It's next to your community," I said, "not in it. I'm the HOA president." Okay. She seemed to expect that title to do something to me, but it didn't. She waited, probably expecting me to start apologizing and moving my own things around on my own property. When I did not, she repeated herself and said, "That vehicle cannot be stored in view." I said, "My house is not under your rules." That was our first interaction, and it pretty much covered the next several months. At first she acted like I was mistaken, then she acted like I was lying, then she acted like if she said the same thing enough times, property records would rewrite themselves out of respect for her confidence. She started stopping by with little reminders, and then she moved on to printed notices. One was about lawn standards and another one was about exterior lighting. Petty BS like that pretty much. Every single time the answer was the same: "This house is not in your HOA." I said it so many times I could have put it on a shirt or something, but she didn't care. She was one of those people who confuse persistence with authority. In her mind, if she wanted control badly enough, that itself became a form of control. One afternoon she knocked while I was asleep after a shift, and my wife answered. The HOA woman started lecturing her about an inspection walk and said that we needed to fix the so-called ATV issue before the weekend. My wife told her very calmly, "This property is not in your association." The woman said, "That has not been properly established." My wife said, "It's in the deed." Then the woman actually said, "I would like a copy." My wife shut the door on her. A normal person would have taken the hint, but she got worse. I'm a police officer, patrol actually, but I keep work separate from home as much as possible and don't make a big deal out of it. A couple of nearby neighbors had figured it out over time, but I never discussed my job with the HOA lady or her son. There was no reason to. My job had nothing to do with the fact that she was trying to boss around property she had no control over. If anything, she seemed to resent me more once she figured out I was not the type to fold just to keep the peace. Her favorite subject by far was my ATV. It was not some giant mud rig, by the way, with huge tires or neon lights, just a regular ATV I used on a friend's land and around my own place when I needed it. Most of the time it stayed in the garage. Sometimes I would pull it partly into the driveway while cleaning, loading gear, or working on something. Every single time it was visible for more than 5 minutes, it was like she had some private alarm system. She would appear and say some version of, "That needs to be moved immediately." And I would say some version of, "No, it doesn't." Once she stood at the edge of my driveway taking pictures with her phone, like she was documenting a crime scene, and I asked, "Do you need me to move so you can get a better angle?" She lowered the phone and said, "You think this is funny?" "A little," I said. That really got to her, and not long after that I met her son. He was old enough to know better and young enough to still carry himself like consequences were something other people got. Loud truck, gym tank top, backwards hat, fake relaxed attitude, the kind of guy who says bro during arguments because he thinks it makes him sound above it all. He wandered over one afternoon while I was pressure washing part of the driveway and stood there staring at the ATV like he was browsing a showroom or something. "That yours?" he asked. "Yeah." He nodded towards it. "Nice. My mom hates that thing." "I know." He laughed. "She said it makes your place look trashy." I shut off the washer and looked at him. "Then she should stop staring at my garage." He gave this little smirk like he thought that we were having a playful guy talk. "I'm just saying, if you kept it out back, there wouldn't be all this drama." If your mom minded her own business, there wouldn't be all this drama either. Then the smirk faded a little. He looked back at the ATV and said, "She runs the neighborhood." "Good for her," I said, "but she doesn't run this property." He shrugged, but it was that fake shrug people do when they are irritated and trying to hide it. Looking back, he had the same reaction she always had when somebody told her no. First disbelief, then annoyance, and then this stubborn refusal to accept that the answer was not gonna change. A few days after that, I came home and found another one of her homemade violation notices taped to my garage. This one claimed that I had 72 hours to get the ATV out of sight or she would move forward with towing. That was the first time her little paper campaign crossed from ridiculous into something I actually took seriously. I walked straight over to her house with the notice in my hand. She was outside with 2 other women, doing that slow neighborhood walk where people care more about being seen than about exercise, and I held up the paper and said, "Did you put this on my garage?" She didn't even deny it. "It was posted as a courtesy. You don't get to threaten towing on property you don't even control. It is not a threat, it's the next step." "For what?" "For non-compliance." I looked at the 2 women with her. Neither one wanted any part of the conversation. Both suddenly got very interested in the sidewalk though. Then I looked back at her and kept my voice even. "Listen carefully here. My property is not in your HOA and you have no authority over my house, my driveway, my garage or anything on it. If you or anyone acting for you touches my ATV, I will report as stolen." She crossed her arms. "You cannot steal what's being removed under community enforcement." "There's no community enforcement here." Her son was in their open garage at that point, close enough to hear. He called out, "For a tow? Relax." So I turned slightly so there was no confusion about who I was talking to and said, "If you touch it, you're gonna get arrested." He laughed. Actually laughed in my face. "Yeah, okay," he said. That was the warning, clear, direct and impossible to misunderstand. After that, small weird things started happening. Nothing dramatic at first, just enough to make me notice a pattern. I would come home and the side gate would be unlatched once the ATV cover had been moved, and another time one of the gas cans in the garage had been shifted from where I knew I left it. Could all of that have been something innocent? Yeah, maybe once. But repeatedly with everything else going on? No. So I put cameras up. Doorbell, driveway, garage, side yard, nothing hidden or fancy, just decent cameras with motion alerts and cloud backup. My wife asked if I really thought the HOA lady would try something, and I said maybe not her personally, but I think her son is dumb enough to think a warning doesn't count if he doesn't respect the person giving it. And that turned out to be exactly the issue. People like that don't hear warnings the way normal people do, they hear them as bluffs. To them, rules are flexible, boundaries are rude, and consequences are mostly paperwork for people without the right last name. But then came the day he finally did it. I had the day off and planned to do some maintenance on the ATV, so I had rolled it towards the front of the garage, got some tools out and was halfway into that kind of weekend project when I got a call asking if I could come in for a short shift because somebody was out and they needed coverage. Not ideal, but not unusual either. So I put the tools aside, straightened up what I could and pulled the garage door mostly down before leaving. I did not latch it fully because I'd been carrying tools in and out, and I figured I'd be back later to finish what I started. My wife already left to help her sister with something, so the house was empty. A few hours later my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the driveway camera. I checked it right away, mostly out of habit, and there was the HOA lady's son walking up my driveway. At first, I thought maybe it was a fake notice, and then I opened the live feed and watched him look around, pull his phone out, duck under the garage door, and a second later he was inside heading straight for the ATV. I pulled over and watched just long enough to make sure I wasn't somehow misreading what I was seeing, but I wasn't. He grabbed the handlebar, started rolling it backwards, and then another guy came in from the driveway to help. They were not there to talk, so I called dispatch. I handled it exactly the way anybody should in that situation. I reported that someone was on my property removing my ATV without permission, gave my address, described both guys, and identified one of them by name. I also told them that I was the homeowner, that I was off duty and in plain clothes, and that I would stay clear until marked until units arrived. It helped that units were already working not far from my area, so the response was quick. Then I called my wife and told her not to come home yet because something stupid was happening and I didn't want her driving into the middle of it. Then I headed back. The whole drive I kept thinking about every fake notice and every speech about standards. Every time she acted like my property was somehow on loan to her personal sense of order. I was not raging, it was past that. I was just done with it all. By the time I got close to my street, they had gotten the ATV out of the garage and into the driveway, and then they managed to start it. The son climbed on and began driving it away like he was doing the most normal thing in the world. His friend was behind him in a pickup, which made it pretty obvious. They expected to move the ATV somewhere else and then come back for him. He barely got moving before the first marked unit came in from the far end of the street and lit everything up. The timing could not have been better. He froze, the ATV jerked awkwardly, and he stalled it almost immediately. His friend in the truck stopped hard behind him. I pulled over farther down and waited until the responding officers had the scene under control before I walked up. The son looked at me and still somehow thought this was gonna smooth itself over. He pointed at the ATV and said, "Tell them this is yours." One of the officers said, "It is his." The son nodded like that solved it. "Yeah, and he knows me. I'm just moving it." I said, "Without permission from my garage." At that point, HOA lady came hurrying over from her yard. She had not been standing there theatrically supervising the whole thing or anything like that, but the speed with which she got involved made it obvious she knew exactly what was going on. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "We've been trying to resolve this property issue for months." One of the officers put a hand up and said, "Ma'am, stop right there." She didn't stop though. "That vehicle has been in ongoing violation of neighborhood standards and my son was helping address it before things escalated." The officer looked at her and said, "Address it how?" "By relocating it from somebody else's garage." She opened her mouth and then closed it and then said, "That's not the point." Another officer had already moved towards the friend in the pickup and started sorting out his involvement. Meanwhile, the son was still trying the casual act. "Come on," he said to me. "You seriously called the cops over this?" I looked at him and said, "I told you exactly what would happen if you touched it." That was the first time his face really changed. Not dramatically, just enough that you could see the confidence crack a little. Up until then, I honestly think he believed this was all just gonna turn into one of those neighborhood arguments where people shout for 10 minutes and then everybody goes home irritated but untouched. So he tried to reset. "I thought my mom had already worked it out with you." "You mean after I told both of you that this property was not in the HOA and nobody had permission to touch it?" He looked at his mom, she looked back at him. Neither one had a better version ready. Then HOA lady tried to turn it into a personality issue. "He's been hostile from the start." That was when I pulled out my phone. I'm a big believer in keeping records when somebody gets weirdly fixated on you, and by that point I had plenty. I showed the officers the camera clip of her son going under my garage door, looking around and rolling the ATV out, then the clip of the second guy coming in to help, and then another clip from earlier in the week showing HOA lady on my property near the garage moving the cover of the ATV, then photos of the homemade notices she had taped to my house and garage, and I also had a message from a neighbor warning me that she had been talking about having the thing hauled off. That pretty much ended the misunderstanding defense. The son switched tactics fast. "Okay, but if she told me it was allowed, that's on her." His mother snapped around. "Excuse me?" "You said the house counted," he said. "It should count." "Mom, that's what you told me." One of the officers said, "Both of you need to stop talking." And that did absolutely nothing. She launched into this whole speech about neighborhood values and keeping standards up and how some people think they can do whatever they want, and the officer cut through it with one simple question: "Is this your property?" She said no. "Is he a member of your HOA?" She started with that it's complicated, and the officer said no, it's not. The son made one more attempt to treat it like a small social problem. He lowered his voice and said to me, "Can we not do this? Seriously? I will just put it back." That, more than anything else, told me he still did not understand. Even standing there with lights flashing and officers around him, he thought the whole thing was still negotiable if he acted embarrassed enough, and I said no. Then the officer told him to turn around, and there it was. Hands behind his back, the cuffs clicked shut. For a split second, he still had that confused look like this was some kind of pause in the conversation before the grown-up fixed things for him. But then it actually hit him. He twisted slightly and said, "Are you serious?" The officer said, "You went onto private property and took a vehicle that wasn't yours. Turn back around." HOA lady lost it. "No, absolutely not. This is ridiculous. He's not a criminal. This is a misunderstanding." The officer told her to back up, but she didn't listen the first time and he told her again more firmly, and that time she stopped. Then she turned to me. "This is vindictive," she said. "You set this up." That was such a ridiculous thing to say that I almost laughed. I said, by parking my own ATV in my own garage, you knew there was a dispute. There was no dispute. There was you refusing to accept no. That landed, you could see it. She tried another angle by saying, we were protecting property values. The officer nearest her said, by sending your son onto somebody else's property? I told him to move it before the situation got worse. There was a small pause right after she said that, just a second or two, but enough for everyone standing there to realize she had stopped dancing around it and had just admitted her part. The officer said, you told him to go onto this property and take that vehicle? And she immediately tried to walk it back. Not like that, I meant as part of the enforcement process. What enforcement process? The HOA process. He's not in your HOA. That's not how this neighborhood works, she said. Again, there was just silence for another second, not because anybody agreed with her, more because it was amazing to hear someone still trying that line while her son was in handcuffs next to a marked unit. The son, meanwhile, had moved on from casual to panicked. I didn't know, man. I thought she had authority. I said, I told you directly that she didn't. He looked sick at that point. Not physically sick, just that pale, stunned look people get when they realize the thing they laughed off is not going away. The friend with the pickup was also being questioned and looked like he wanted to teleport somewhere else. He kept saying versions of, I thought we were just towing it, which did him no favors because towing somebody else's ATV out of their garage is still not normal, and by then neighbors had started drifting outside. Nothing brings people to their windows faster than flashing lights on a quiet street. A few people stayed back on porches and a couple came closer. HOA lady noticed that she had an audience and got louder, which was a mistake. This man has been a problem since he moved in, she said. I answered, because I won't follow HOA rules that don't apply to me? She pointed towards the ATV, because you keep that thing on display like nobody else matters. I said, it's my property. One of the neighbors standing nearby said, well, this was bound to happen eventually. Nobody disagreed. That was another thing that made the whole scene feel real in the worst way. No one looked shocked by her behavior. They looked like people watching a long-running problem finally hit the wall. The officers took statements, I gave mine. They copied the camera footage and photographed the garage area and the notices, because by that point it was clear this was not random. There had been a pattern, a warning, and then the theft. HOA lady kept trying to interrupt with phrases like civil matter and community dispute, but once she had admitted telling him to move the ATV, that was not really helping her. The son was still talking while they walked him towards the cruiser. This is insane, I didn't even damage it. My mom told me it was allowed. What am I supposed to do now? That last one was the one that really summed him up. Even then, he still thought someone else should step in and solve the consequences for him. He got put in the back of the cruiser, still trying to talk his way out of reality, and then the units left. And just like that, the street got quiet again. Not peaceful quiet, more like that weird empty quiet after everyone's just watched something they'll be talking about for the next 6 months. People slowly went back inside, and a couple neighbors stayed out long enough to ask if I was okay and shake their heads about the whole thing. HOA lady went into her house without looking at anyone. Then the next few days were the fallout. First came the victim act, which was no surprise, and HOA lady started telling people that I'd overreacted apparently and used my position over a neighborhood misunderstanding. That version didn't travel very far because too many people had either seen the stop or already had their own stories about her trying to push past what she actually had authority to do, and then came the apology tour. Except it was not really an apology. A few days later, she showed up at my door with her husband. He looked like a man who had spent years cleaning up after someone else's ego. Tired face, low voice, the whole thing. She started by saying that they would like to resolve this privately, but I stayed behind the screen door and said, there's nothing private about what happened. Her husband said, our son made a mistake. And I said, after being warned not to touch my property. HOA lady cut in immediately and said, based on incomplete information. That told me all I needed to know. She still was not accepting what had happened. I said, he went into my garage and took my ATV. You told him to do it. There's video of both the lead up and what happened. Nothing about this is unclear. She took a breath and tried a softer voice. Surely there's room for neighborly grace. And I said, you taped fake notices to my house for months and threatened to tow property you had no authority over. Her husband looked down at the porch for a second. Then she said the thing that really proved she had learned nothing. She said that if I drop this, that she'll make sure the HOA leaves me alone. I actually stared at her for a second because I couldn't believe that was the offer she thought would help. Stop the consequences from the crime your family committed, and in exchange you would stop harassing me in ways you were never entitled to begin with. I just said, you need to leave. Her husband gave a short nod like he knew that was the end of it. She started to argue and he quietly told her, "Let's go." That was the smartest thing anyone from that house said the entire time. After that, the rest was the boring part. Statements, damaged photos, follow-up calls, etc. The ATV had some minor damage from how they dragged it out and the way it lurched and got dropped when the police lights hit. That got documented. The footage spoke for itself though. The homemade notices mattered because they showed the pattern. The warning mattered because it killed any attempt to claim it was some innocent misunderstanding. Her son ended up facing charges. The friend had a better outcome because he mostly looked like an idiot who got dragged into a bad idea and had the good sense not to double down once things went sideways. HOA lady had her own problems from admitting that she told her son to move the ATV. I will leave it at that. And before I forget, of course they had to pay some fines too. The social side of it was almost more satisfying than the official side. Once people in the neighborhood realized what had happened, a lot of them got more comfortable pushing back on her. Some looked more closely at where she had been stretching HOA authority, and some apparently started comparing notes about notices and complaints she had handed out over the years. I heard from a couple neighbors that plenty of people had been putting up with her for a long time because arguing with her was exhausting and most people would rather just comply than deal with drama. That only works until someone finally doesn't, and once a person who acts untouchable gets proven very touchable, the whole act starts to collapse. At some point after that, there was some kind of shake-up inside the HOA. I had nothing to do with it because, once again, not my HOA, but from what I was told, she was pushed out of the president role after enough residents got tired of hearing about standards and leadership from someone whose own family had just gotten arrested over an ATV they had no right to touch. She tried to use power she didn't have, and in the end she lost the power she did have. The next one is from r/maliciouscompliance and is titled "Sent on a Quest for the Impossible Plint Ladder." This happened decades ago, before everyone carried a cell phone. So from working as a temp in several warehouses, I know some of the ways the old guard would mess around with the beginners by asking them to locate something that doesn't even exist. In kitchens, someone would ask for a holeless colander, and in warehouses they would send you on a quest for the plint ladder, which is a ladder to climb a baseboard/skirting board, so I came prepared. The warehouse manager sent me on the plint ladder quest and I asked him if it could be outside too. He humored me and told me he didn't know where it was stored, so I just had to look for it everywhere. "Ask around," he added, because that would make it even more hilarious. So then I pretended to look around until I was out of view, then I walked out of the warehouse and went to a coffee shop to smoke some drug I won't mention, and read a book. I didn't return for a couple hours, but they didn't know where I had gone. So after several hours had gone by, I returned to the warehouse and reported to the manager that the quest had not been easy, but I found him a plint ladder. Then I handed him a small Playmobil toy ladder. I could see the fury in his eyes for me, taking the whole afternoon off to come back with an actual plint ladder instead of making a fool of myself, but since I had merely followed his orders, he couldn't dock my pay. He never sent me out to get anything after that. And yeah guys, thanks for watching, I will see you again tomorrow.